All right, so the next thing we want to talk about is product and non-product costs. And these are I say fairly important, they're actually very important for what we discuss in this class. So non-product costs are really the costs that are related to selling the product. Typically, we call these selling, general, and administrative expenses or costs. We shorten that down to SG&A. So your SG&A, what was your SG&A? What was your selling, general, and administrative costs? Typically, those are going to be things like your salaries or commissions for your salespersons, any advertising or marketing expenses you had, rent you pay on office spaces or warehouses, things that are not directly really correlated to the actual cost of producing the product. They're going to be costs related to selling of the product. The next type of cost we have are product costs, and we'll break those down into 4 categories, and then we'll talk about manufacturing overhead. So product costs are the costs that are related directly to obtaining or manufacturing the product, right? You're either purchasing or you're manufacturing. We break those down further into what we call direct materials, which are costs that are related directly, that are easily traceable and material enough, that are costly enough to justify tracing them to the product. So this would be like the wood that you use to make the top of a table or the legs of a table. Those are direct materials. They're easy to trace as a core component or a direct product, a direct piece of material for that product. They cost enough, the cost of them is material enough that it justifies us tracing them. Okay. The next one we have is indirect materials, and these are kind of the opposite of that, right? These are costs that aren't easily or directly traceable to the product, or they are not costly enough. There's not enough material cost to them to justify tracing them to the product. This is going to be things more like the glue on a tabletop. It is hard to cost out exactly how much glue you're using on a tabletop. Now, I know a lot of factories are going to use machines, and that's going to be calibrated and all that good stuff. So they may, if they have good calibration machines and they've got, it's within a good error margin, they may include glue as a direct cost. But typically speaking, in this class, for simplification, things like glue, paint, that kind of stuff is going to be an indirect material. Next thing is direct labor. So it's the same thing as direct materials, except it has to do with labor. So it's the people that actually we can directly tie the cost of their labor to manufacturing the product. If you produce something on a line, if you are part of a boat factory, all of the employees who are working on that boat or on that product coming down that production line, those are all going to be direct labor. Indirect labor, again, is just kind of the opposite, right? It's the costs that for the employees that aren't directly related to the manufacturing of the product. So this is going to be like environmental services staff. This is going to be admins that sit at the front desk and schedule appointments. This could be engineers. This could be supervisors, could be the guy that's doing the purchasing, the requisition officer, right? There's lots of things that this could be, but just know that it's the employees that don't directly manufacture the product. That's the easiest way to explain it. And finally, we've got what we call manufacturing overhead, and these are all of the costs that we incur to manufacture a product other than direct materials and direct labor. So as you can imagine, this includes your indirect materials, indirect labor, and then sometimes you may have other costs like utilities or something like that. So the next subject we got to talk about is levels of cost behavior. So we identify the behavior of a cost beyond the non-product or product level. Okay, so we go beyond just that very simple classification of this is a product cost or a non-product cost. Now we can say, is this a unit-related cost? Is this something associated directly with the unit? Okay, and we need this to determine whether the cost is relevant to short-term decision-making. So we would look at something like unit-related costs. These vary with the number of units. So this is things like shipping costs, raw materials, that kind of stuff. The next one is batch-related costs, and they vary with the number of batches, regardless of the number of units in a batch. So one of the most popular ones that we talk about is what we call setup costs. So this is the cost of setting up a machine and getting it ready to run through a production, right? That's usually the most typical one that we think about, because it costs us that setup. Every time we run a new batch, maybe we've got to set up differently, and so those are the setup costs. Ordering costs, so ordering the goods is part of that batch-related cost. Then you have product sustaining costs, and this just varies with the number of product lines. So like, Frito-Lay is a good example of this. They've got tons of advertising costs because they've got Funyuns, they've got Doritos, they've got Fritos, they've got Lay's potato chips, they've got all of those things. So you've got a bunch of different product lines, and you've got a bunch of different advertising. And aside from that, they're spending a lot of money on research and development. That's why we see biscuits and gravy flavored Lay's. That's why we see chicken and waffles flavored Lay's, right? Sriracha flavored Lay's. That all came from R&D costs, research and development. And then finally, we have facility sustaining costs. These are the costs that we incur to make sure that we have a facility to operate in. These are things like rent and insurance. Relevant variable analysis. We're not going to hit this too hard, but we are going to talk about it just a little bit, okay? So these are variables that are analyzed, and we determine if they are relevant to a short-term decision-making process. Like we said back here, these cost behaviors, we look at them to determine whether or not the cost is relevant. This is what we're talking about, okay? So relevant variables, it's a revenue or it's a cost that occurs in the future, but it differs among the alternatives. Talk about alternatives when we get to the decision-making process, right? Steps to making a short-term decision. But just know that it's the costs or revenues from those differing alternatives. Okay. So all relevant costs have to be considered before you make that short-term operating decision. Some of the costs that we'll look at are things like sunk costs. These are costs that come up from past decisions. They're never relevant. So when you see a sunk cost, just know it is not relevant to our short-term decision making. This would be like, well, I already paid for a machine back in 1995. I should not be considering that cost in my short-term decision making because that's sunk. I've already paid it. The next one is the opportunity costs. This is the benefit foregone when choosing one alternative over the other. They're always relevant. So we'll get to a pretty good example of what an opportunity cost is as we walk through the decision-making problem at the end of this chapter. So, and then we have incremental costs. These are the additional costs or revenues associated with an alternative. They could be relevant. They might be relevant. So you just have to do a closer analysis of those to determine whether or not those costs are actually relevant. So let's talk about making short-term decisions and the kind of short-term decisions we have to make. So there are several types that we consider. The first one is the accept or reject. This is usually when a customer makes a special order with you, right? They're like, I know typically you only produce 50 of these shelving units for me, but I need you to produce 150 for me. And a lot of times when they ask for those larger quantities, sometimes they'll also ask for a discount on those, on that quantity. So you'll have to make a decision on whether or not to accept or reject that offer. Do you say, yes, we can make a profit off this, so we will go ahead and make those additional 100 units for you? Do you say, no, we're not going to make any money off this, we can't, or at least we can't at that price? Would you be willing to still make the order for this price? The next one is the make or buy decision. This decision is when a company really has to make a decision on, I keep saying more decision, sorry. This is when you look at it and you go, is it cheaper for us to buy this product and sell it, or is it cheaper for us to make this product and sell it? So really it comes down to, do you process or produce this internally, or do you outsource the production to a third party? Okay. If the relevant cost of this is less than the relevant cost to buy the product, so the relevant cost to make the product is less than the relevant cost to buy the product, then we would make it. Okay. And then the keep or drop decision, this comes down to whether or not a company thinks they're going to make or sell enough of a certain product to generate enough relevant revenue to keep it around. So if you think that the relevant revenue lost exceeds the relevant costs saved from dropping the product line, you're going to want to keep the product line, right? So if you're going to lose more revenue than you're going to save in costs, then you want to keep the production, the product line around. This is like when Campbell's comes out with a terribly flavored soup in a can, and they decide, you know what, this is just not going to make any more money. Let's drop that product. Another example is, like, the one I think is fun is the McRib example at McDonald's, right? Notice how the McRib has a farewell tour every year. Well, that's because they know that is an easy way for them to generate quite a bit of revenue on a product they don't keep around all the time. So, I'll end the video here. The next video we'll start walking through some decisions, some example decisions.